I'm Tutaleni Asino from the EdTech program. And I intentionally titled this My Take on, not because I wanted to put my name on there twice, but just because this is my take on evaluation. I'm hoping that we can really, I'm structuring this much more as a conversation around evaluation. So hopefully we'll get a lot of different takes on what evaluation is. All right, so I thought we'd first start off with a little bit of shared meaning and just talk a little bit about the difference between assessment and evaluation. Because I think a lot of the time we tend to use a lot of these terms interchangeably, whether we're talking about assessment, measurement, evaluation, summative assessment, formative assessment, and all those type of things. A lot of the time we use those terms interchangeably, but as people from REMS will probably tell you, those things are not exactly all the same. So just maybe some feedback on what is assessment, how does it differ from evaluation? You knew that was going to be part of the class participation, so.
Wait, I'll Google it.
Yes.
Assessment more of a rigid scale and evaluation of slides.
I've heard those ones as well.
Formative, you're figuring out along the way in short periods of time how people are doing.
Mm-hmm.
And summative is assessing at the end,
yeah,
whatever the goals and outcomes were met.
Yeah.
Depending on whether it's learning or not.
Mm-hmm.
Kathy Thomas went to next catch up too.
No.
Evaluation is looking back at the whole program to determine how it worked and what needs to change and that sort of thing.
Okay. And people online are more than welcome to participate as well. I just unmuted everybody.
Okay.
So, well, Ayo, since you volunteered. Right. So a lot of these terms, as we know, I use interchangeably, right? I found some, just took some graphics online in terms of what the difference between these things are. Again, those are just screenshots online. I'm not saying that's what I believe or not, but really so I'm presenting this based on my, how I conceptualize the difference between assessment and evaluation. Assessment for me is really when you're trying to almost like assess like different activities in the class. So if you have 10 different modules in the class, you might assess each one of those individually. And then evaluation will be assessing the whole class as well. But that conceptualization also falls short, right? Because you could also evaluate a whole module if you have different assessment within that module as well. So there's a lot of different conceptualization of what assessment and evaluation is. Of course, last session we had a wonderful presentation by my brilliant colleagues on assessment. So and I thought this was really great because they gave a lot of resources on assessments that I'm not really gonna go through and hack those, especially since Dr. Sansbury has them on her website that everybody can go through there and look at that. And it talk about formative assessment, summative assessment, and all the different kind of assessments that that you can conduct. For me, though, I'm just going to focus on evaluation broadly, and I really think that evaluation is indivisible from course design, right? So you can't really talk about course design without talking about evaluation, and you can't really talk about evaluation without talking about how you design, right? There's a lot of, from an instruction design standpoint, often, at least for my training, is that you have to start off about what your learning outcomes are going to be and how you're going to evaluate those before you even start talking about how you design the class. Right? But at the same time, you can't really talk about evaluations if you don't take care of how you're designing that class as a whole. Just some quick refreshers on strategies for designing online courses. First one for me is really what's important is about involving the learners. Some of my students might think that I take that too extreme because I have gone as far as going to a class without a syllabus and having us design that course from the ground up day one, right? I think so, right? Right. So involving the learner is really, really important, not just in the evaluation of the class, but also in the course design. Because you want to be in conversation with your students and their needs and desires from that class. Also, of course, you have to make sure that collaboration works. So once you have that partnership between you and your learners and how you're designing that class, you then also want to ensure that there is collaboration between the students themselves. And then also, one of the things that's really important is making sure that there's consistency in how you are structuring your course. So you can't have, and for me, it's as simple as even just how you lay out your items. So if today, week 1, you have this button on the left, you can't have on week 3, this button is now at the bottom right, right? A lot of that stuff that might not be a big deal to the designer can cause cognitive load to the student who's now had to figure all these things out. And then of course, it's always important to reflect and revise your course materials over time. So again, for me, really the important thing about evaluation, you really have to link it to the course design itself. If I can get this key to work. All right. All right. So my take on evaluation. I think evaluation can be, especially for online courses, can be divided into 3 categories. Right? You have evaluation of student learning, right? So the learning that has happened, the learning that you have intended to happen in that class through your learning objectives, have those learning objectives been met, right? If you don't have learning objectives in your syllabus, that's really something that you want to have at every one of your syllabus. It's even better if you have a learning objective for each module, each lesson that you have, because you really want to make sure that you are clear on what the learning outcomes for that, right? So once you have those objectives, then you have to evaluate overall whether or not you have achieved them. So if you have a class on changing tires on your car, at the end, you want to evaluate at the end of that class, can your students actually change the tires, right? You might have different modules within that class, which might involve maybe selecting a tire, checking the tire pressure, and all those different modules, which you can then assess. But overall, if your objective was to teach people how to change a tire, you want to be able to evaluate that. And then I think there's also the program alignment type of evaluation, right? Which a lot of us who teach might not get to that level, right? But for our EdTech program, Penny, Dr. Thompson is the one who is our program chair. So she produces a report annually that that can at least show that we're meeting our program objectives. So there's an evaluation that's specifically targeted to that. But I think for me, the evaluation that I want to focus on is the online teaching evaluation, right? How do we evaluate whether or not we are actually effective as online educators? Right? Those are my 3 takes. Does anybody have other takes that perhaps how you conceptualize evaluation?
What about any sort of external review or feedback from students or observation from, would you stick that under one of those? Well, guess student learning,
Yeah.
you might, student learning and response,
Mm-hmm.
student surveys of instruction would come under that.
Yeah, I would put that them
And
under
online
that.
teaching, it might,
Yeah.
if you had an external reviewer evaluate your teaching, it might come under that.
Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of overlap. So probably depicting it that way as separate is not the best way. But there's definitely a lot of different overlaps. So, other conceptualizations? I think, is someone talking online? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Right. David says evaluation is performance based on a set criteria, whereas assessment is setting the baseline in reference of the set criteria. I'm going to unmute you just a little bit, David, here. If you maybe can you elaborate on that a little bit? David? Okay. Going to go mute again. All right. So for me, evaluating online teaching really comes down the way that I at least conceptualize it. It comes down to two things: on how am I doing, or how did I do? Right? It's sort of that simple for me. How did I, at the end of the class, how did I do it? Was I an effective teacher, or was I ineffective? However you define what that effectiveness is, right? And ideally, you should be evaluating also through the course, where you should also somewhere midpoint of your class asking how am I doing right now, because then you can hopefully, if things are not going well, shift a bit so that you can meet the needs of your students. So, but for me, it really comes down to those two things: how am I doing, or how are we doing, and how did I do at the end of the semester, right? So for me, you're also really evaluating quality of your teaching, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. These are just some of the things that I have thought about and also looked up in other sources that I'm hoping that we can also add more to that. But it starts really when you think about evaluating, especially as a whole class, or as a whole course, you start off by using some sort of rubric. I've looked on ITLE's website. I don't know if the university has a rubric that is sort of general to evaluate a whole course. Does anybody know if we have that at the university?
There's a lot of discussion at one point about the quality matters rubric, and it was batted around about using that as is, or adapting it to meet OSU specifically. I don't think they ever settled on one.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't find one for OSU, but there are also plenty online as well that you can look at, and I can add some at the end of the PowerPoint as a resource. But it's also really important to analyze your course from and evaluate your course from a student's perspective. How are students looking at it, right? How are they processing the information? And it could be as simple as take, if you're online using viewing the course materials through student view, right? And make sure that all your links and everything and all the materials are showing up the way that it needs to be. But if you want to evaluate whether or not your class is of quality, looking at it from a student's perspective is really, really important. The other way could also be to invite a peer to review your class. I know that's very common in a face-to-face class, but it can just be as effective in an online class where you can give your colleague access to your class, or have them as a guest to be able to actually see what you're doing and how you're doing it. That could really provide you with some constructive feedback. If you are partnering up with your students, it's really important to assess your artifacts at the end of your class and throughout. Especially if you're teaching a class that you've taught over time, you can compare how you have done before to how you're doing now. I have a class a survey that I give to all my courses at the beginning and at the end. It's a pre-course survey and a post-course survey, and it's the same link. So I have data from the first year that I taught to now, and I can kind of see exactly how they feel about the class and things like that. So, and see how it changes over time. So for me, that's how I try to evaluate whether or not my teaching is of quality. You also want to not leave this at the end of the term or the semester rather. ITLE has a nice video on the benefits of mid-course evaluations that if you haven't seen, you should probably check that out. And for me, I really like having that mid-semester or mid-course evaluation because it at least tells me whether or not I'm in the right direction. Because if you leave that towards the end, most of the evaluation that you end up getting are going to be people who are unsatisfied at the end of that class. So, and you want to evaluate your class in terms of the type of interactions that are happening, right? The student-to-student interactions and the student-to-student instructors. I tend to be much more quiet in my online classes because I really like to have the students engage with each other. Because I think as we have all learned is that often when you respond to a post, students tend to think of that as the end of the conversation, or whatever path that you have set on the conversation becomes then what everybody else follows. So I try not to do that on a weekly basis. I respond often when things maybe head in the wrong direction, or I engage here and there with different students so that they don't feel like the class is just an autopilot. But what I also try to do is that at the end of, at the beginning of each week, I sum up what happened in the class the week before so that they at least know that I'm engaged with them. But you really want to be able to evaluate how are students engaging with each other as peers, and how are they engaging with me and as an instructor. And then of course, overall, you want to be able to check, are they actually learning? Am I meeting my learning objectives? Right. So I have just a few resources here that on online teaching and course evaluations and so forth. You can click on this once I upload that to the Google Doc and go through it and so on. So there's no need to go through that. But I'm just going to point on this one. I like this one. Let's see if it opens. This is a course online course evaluation guideline that is from UWL. Apparently my Microsoft has crashed PowerPoint, so we'll just not. So I really like this in terms of the way that it's divided and gives you specific measurements and evaluation criteria that you want to try to go through. But we are going to reopen up PowerPoint to go back to. Okay. So and then for me, really, the most important thing when it comes to, for me, this is a learning philosophy, a teaching philosophy, really, in terms of how I conduct my courses. I really genuinely involve in this concept of learners as designers, as design partners. So, and this means involving them not just in the semester when the class has started, but also from the beginning of when you're actually engaging with the syllabus, when you're putting out the material, but also on how you do evaluations. A lot of the time we tend to be more comfortable with involving learners at the beginning or throughout, but rarely in the evaluation standpoint. And I think it's really important to be able to involve the learners also in the evaluation and ask them about how evaluation should go. Ask them specific questions about, well, what were you expecting from this class that you didn't get, right? Halfway through, what is it that you were expecting from me as an instructor that you're not receiving now, so that you can actually at least change throughout the rest of the semester. I think if you engage with your learners as partners throughout the class, your evaluations are going to be that much more fruitful, instead of getting something back that you're like, oh, well, I wish I had known that before now. So that's my take on evaluation. And if anybody wants to contradict me, that's great. So any questions, feedback, or your take on evaluations? We have about 5 minutes.
I like that slide with the Venn diagram. Is that one your own definitions and takes?
Let's see.
In the cartoon, it seems like the cartoon you said you got.
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's not my own.
I like that assessment evaluation.
Yeah. It helped me sort of clarify, because I was talking to different people today about, okay, how do you define assessment? How do you define evaluation? But really the common theme is that assessment is the thing that is more ongoing in the class, and evaluation can be much broader. But again, a lot of that stuff is so much overlap, which is why a lot of people end up using those things interchangeably.
Well, and evaluation of a grant is very ongoing.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I might put that in both categories.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe situational too. This is classroom.
And I think it's definitely, you're right. Is if you're talking about classroom space, if you're talking about maybe online learning for a corporate setting, if you're talking about curriculum or grant and so on, there's a lot of these things that are not as clear.
So, do you evaluate at the end of the class?
You can evaluate at the end of the class, but for me, the challenge with evaluating only at the end of the class is that only benefits the students that come after, right? So next semester it will benefit you, but the students who you're teaching now will not really benefit from that evaluation. So I think it's important to also try to evaluate in the middle of the class, and then evaluate again at the end.
I am doing great. Looking forward to retirement. How about you?
No, multitasking.
And what's next after evaluation?
Well, for me, the next thing after evaluation is the feedback loop, right? Because usually once you get that data from evaluation, then you should be able to feed it back into your course redesign, so that the next time you teach this, you can improve from whatever the process was. That's why for me, I think it's really evaluating midway through is really important, because then, if I'm a terrible teacher in my 4th week, hopefully I can get feedback, and then I can improve for my students in the next of the 4 weeks. So I think it's a really cyclical process.
Okay. You had a question?
Okay. There's a question. Ayo, you're unmuted.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Thank you very much for the workshop on evaluation. So my question is tailored towards how to know the design is actually working.
Let me see if I understand correctly. Are you asking about how do you know that your class design is working, or how you know if your evaluation that you design is good?
Yes, that's right.
The last one or the first one?
The last one.
Okay, okay. That's a very good question. Anybody has an idea? The question is, how do you know if your evaluation the design of your evaluation is actually good to get you the feedback that you're seeking. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, it's exactly that. There's a few ways to do it. One would be to, if you use the evaluation more than once, you can of course look at the data to see if it gets you what you're looking for. But you know, there's also a lot of validated evaluations designs out online already anyway that have been proven to work, that you can at least start there and see, because then you know that they have already been validated as effective. Then you can implement those into your course.
Okay. So are there like checklists that we'll be using to evaluate online classes?
There are a few out there. In the PowerPoint, I have a few links that I have posted that you can go through, and you can download a few things as well. But a lot of the things are also going to be dependent on your class and what you're teaching or what you're using the evaluation for. If it's for a class, if it's you know, like Dr. Stansbury was saying, if it's for a grant or if it's for whatever. So I tend to hesitate to give one checklist that is going to be the perfect all for everything. But there's a few out there.
All right. Thank you.
Sure. 2 minutes left. Yes.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Because you said you want to have kind of like evaluation in the middle of the course.
Mm-hmm.
So can you recommend like specific questions that you can ask to a student? Because me, during the semester, in the middle of the semester, I always ask some questions to the student, like, because I want to know what's going on with them.
Yeah.
So I want to know like what kind of support do they need from me. So
Yeah.
that's what I ask the student.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recommend any specific questions?
For me, the one question that I always ask first is, was this class what you expected it to be when you registered, right? Because for me, that's, if the student expected something else and what is happening, then I need to sort of understand that and why that's happening. I ask a lot about my course design. Is the information easy to find, or is there any way that I can make this stuff better? I also ask about interactions in the class, and just trying to really get their perspective. But also a lot of the time, because I give them a pre-course survey that asks them a lot of what they're expecting, then I'm in a sense doing my evaluation. That's almost the second part, because the first time I did the pre-course, and then I have the middle one, and then the end of that. So, does anybody else do a similar thing, maybe question that they ask in their class?
I do, and a lot with undergrads, I check in on like the pace of the course to see if they feel like it's appropriate. And I also, because I usually do project-based courses, especially with undergrad, so I typically check in to see if they feel like the activities that we do in class help prepare them to actually complete those projects. I think the other two things are what they think the strengths of the course are, or any suggestions that they have for improvements, whether it's this semester or for future sections of the class.
All right. Well, that is. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I mean, I like to ask about the strength of the course so that makes me feel better.
What do you mean by strength of the course, though? How do you ask that?
I just say, I have like an open-ended question, just say, please use space to identify strengths of the course.
Okay.
And that varies from student to student, but it's ends up being, when I look at the trends of it, pretty consistent.
Okay.
The things that they mentioned. So, and you know, earlier in the form that I usually send them, it might give them ideas of things that they might want to talk about. Because they're, you know, rating not only the instructor, but also the content of the course on a variety of different scales. So.
Somebody said earlier today that when I was asking about assessment and evaluation, they said that assessment are things that are grade dependent and evaluations are not. I mean, it's not that black and white, but for me, that sort of helps because if you ask open-ended questions about that are evaluative and you don't assign any sort of grading to it, sometimes I think you might be able to get some more open information. So, right. All right. Thank you very much.